Hello, it's June 2022, and in some of my videos I briefly mentioned something I describe as law becoming like theoretical mathematics, neither of which having a basis in reality. And this kind of ties into, for example, pseudosciences, and I've mentioned extensively about the liberal arts theoretical pseudoscience of psychology. And it's through this academic process that we see, for example, liberalism being really pushed into mainstream. And that's why, for example, I've said repeatedly that even the most conservative type of person has been infected with liberalism. Now, I'm not going to get into the history and the different kinds of government and everything else. That's not the point here. I want to focus more on, call it pseudo-reality. Now, pseudosciences, for example, are just theory-based, and people accept theories as fact. And there's an assumption that a theory has been tested. But when you start looking even at the title of some things, it's just all theory, like the theory of evolution, the theory of gravity, the theory of all sorts of things. They're all theories that people have come to accept despite the name of whatever it is that they're accepting as factual, having the word theory in its title. It's this acceptance of theories that skew reality. And when society, say for example, societies are built on just a bunch of theories, lose touch with reality. And the education system is a big contributor to the fall of civilizations. And I've talked extensively, even did a series of, I want to call them stories, on the cycles of civilization. And I believe that playlist is still up. There's 4 in that series. Actually, there's 5. And I think one of them is not public. I'll have to look. Worth listening to. They're just fictional stories, but they tell a story. Anyway, I digress. So we have liberalism creating a false reality. And I guess you can say this is why the whole world's a stage, because nothing is based in reality. Now let's take, for example, law. And this does tie into, for example, injustices across the board and wrongful convictions, where there's an assumption by most people in society that there's something magical about law. And then the practitioners of law, which include judges, are more human than human and have strict guidelines to go by. Those guidelines can be skewed to even circumvented, and there's ways around it. And as with my case, completely ignored. And this is very harmful for society. Now, I've used myself an example, how injustice towards one person impacts everyone around them. And this causes a ripple effect. So an injustice to one person affects everyone around them. Now imagine a society where there's countless of people experiencing injustice, and now we see, like dropping pebbles into a pond, how the ripples will start touching each other and creating little waves. And these waves in society are very harmful. And then I'm just going to segue for a moment. We have omitted in our society, for example, the rite of passage. Traditionally, when young adults become young adults from children, something is done or achieved that gives them the rite of passage. But when you omit that, young people are lost. They have no identity. And then this segues into trying to find something to identify with. And then we get into even, for example, drugs and alcohol and parties and carefree, and we see a downward spiral. because there's no moment that that person has that will say, you are now no longer a child, for example. You're an adult because you've achieved this. And even having some sort of, I'm going to use this as a loose descriptive, a ritual that signifies that that person has achieved something. Now, we do see this, for example, in academia, where you graduate and you have a graduation party and you wear the robe and the whole 9 yards, and you're giving a certificate in a ceremony and in front of all your peers, and everyone's happy and excited. And I guess you can say a lot of hopes and dreams are wanting to be realized at that moment. But then we have reality and people competing for the same type of jobs and everything else, but I digress. That set aside, when you have that kind of ceremony, that rite of passage to work in a particular field, if that field is based on, for example, pseudosciences, then, well, we'll just leave it at that, right? But going back to law, for example, law is something abstract. Now, when you contrast, for example, something like law and considering its jurisprudence, the philosophy, the so-called science of law, and that would be considered a pseudoscience, but I digress. You contrast that with actual practical sciences. And in today's world, and I've said this before, practical sciences have been confused with theoretical sciences, and theoretical sciences have been accepted as fact. So a practical science would be the invention of anything: the automobile, a cell phone, or the telephone period, the radio, television. Like it or hate it, it's still a practical science because there's things there, something tangible is being built, it can be tested, it can be fixed. When you get into the pseudosciences, nothing can be tested, and, well, being fixed is relative or even subjective. And this is how our society is built on pseudosciences. And what can be done to correct this? Who knows? Take, for example, everything. Say you have two parties involved in a lawsuit. You have two opinions. Then you hire a lawyer or an agent to argue your position, to be a salesperson to a judge or even a jury. And everyone is just all opinion based. There's nothing that can say, okay, well, I'm going to use an analogy, say for a carpenter, that piece of wood has to be 12 inches, we only have 11 inches. Now, a lawsuit could be based on that, yes, but I'm trying to highlight, to show that there's nothing definite, say, for example, with law. And the liberal arts, theoretical pseudoscience of psychology is probably the worst culprit for that, because aside from being a weapon being used, it's really opinions of somebody who has a title, and people achieve titles, so their opinions can carry more weight in society, and people go, oh, well, that person has been trained or learned a specific field, and so they must be an expert, or at least know more than the average person. And then when you get into a particular field, really shouldn't even be existing, then that creates a whole different topic. But, for example, keeping with the example of law, it's a pseudoscience. There's nothing definite. Setting aside, for example, as with my case, agendas being imposed. People, it's hard for the common person to fathom how that type of injustice happens every day. You don't want to accept that, because if you challenge that, then people become scared. People don't want to be scared. They want to think, oh, everything's okay, putting their heads in the sand, right? So I just really wanted to touch up on this, how liberal arts, it's like social studies and humanities and all these things are being forced, because when you go into post-secondary, usually you have to take as mandatory several of these courses throughout your schooling, and that's what plants the seeds. And even if you're going to these courses and you're thinking that this is stupid, you don't care about it, it's still planting the seeds, because you got to remember you're in these classes for several months, and something's going to kind of seep in to your mainstream thought, and you might even come up with, yeah, okay, this sounds good. And where we see, for example, a lot of young people buy into liberalism because it's paints the picture of a utopia, a utopian paradise. And what we see throughout history is the complete opposite. But now we're going to get into a political discussion, and that's not what this video is about. This video is really about pseudosciences, creating a pseudo-reality when, for example, talking about law. Anyway, just hopefully things to think about. Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, comment, and share.
Listen to this and write it down if you can't remember it. You're never going to outgrow warfare. You simply must learn to fight. I hear people saying to me, oh, when is it going to get easier? When you die.